please join me in welcoming the Honorable Sylvia Garcia and the Honorable Ron Simmons. Ma'am, thank you. Thank you for being here. Representative, thank you so much for being here. Good morning. Happy to have you both here. Thank you very much. Representative Simmons.
Well, we're glad, before we get started,
Yes.
Evan, you're going to, where did you say y'all were going soon?
Texarkana.
Okay, so I want to make sure that you come back here alive. Don't go there and say Texarkana. It's Texarkana.
Texarkana.
Texarkana. Let's try it again. Okay. Texarkana.
I may bring you with
good.
me to
Yes.
actually. You could be my protection if I get crosswise in these Texas.
Mr. Van Dever will take care of it.
Good. I have to pronounce Van Dever correctly. That's the first thing I have to work on, actually. So, Representative Simmons, let me start with you, and let me ask you the question that I and a lot of, I think, other people have asked from the very beginning of this session. I'm not certain that there's been a satisfactory answer to this point. What problem are we trying to solve with this legislation? I can't figure out at various points if it's a public safety problem, if it's a local control problem, if it's a federal government overreach problem, maybe it's components of all of those. What would you say is the problem we're trying to solve?
Well, I think when the issue first came up, it was a combination of those. At that time, the Obama administration had put out an edict through the Department of Education.
This is the so-called Dear Colleague letter, right?
Yeah.
May the 13th of 2016.
Correct.
Right, yes.
And Charlotte had passed a resolution that had prompted the North Carolina legislature to take action. We had gone through the Houston HERO ordinance resolution and callback and all that. So I think it just became something that became aware to the public. And what we saw was, although maybe limited, some pattern of, in Texas, political subdivisions taking a progressive stride, that's what they would want to call it, in this particular area. And so that causes us, some of us in Austin, to say, okay, wait just a minute. Is this the right stride to take or not? And whether or not the policy's right or not is really two separate questions. It's where should it be done? In my opinion, if we need to take this step, then it needs to be done at the state level so that things are the same as in Austin as they are in Amarillo.
Senator Garcia, there is not a lot that people on the two sides of this issue agree on, but there does seem to be a general belief that the breadcrumbs lead back to President Obama, that the Dear Colleague letter in May did kick off this conversation wherever it's gone, that was at least a beginning of the conversation. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't really see it that way. I think, quite frankly, as one of my superintendents told me differently, she said, Sylvia, we know how to take care of our babies locally at the school district level. I mean, do they really think that now all of a sudden transgender children are coming out of the woodwork? I mean, it has been there a long time. Local school districts have been handling it. I don't know of any school district that actually called Austin and said, oh my God, we don't know what to do, send us guidance, send us help. So, it's been there. I think the Dear Colleague letter that's been referred to is really not even relevant. It's already been canceled. It's already been done away with.
Well, it was rescinded, but I guess, Senator, the issue is that this state hates the federal government more than almost any other. And the idea that the federal government telling us what to do or suggesting what we should do or might do, it's not that surprising that it would cause a reaction up the street.
Well, I think that's true of many people down the street, but it's not true of all of us. I mean, because it's so much easier for these big government Republicans to yell foul at the federal government, but they really don't sit back and idly with all the demands they're making of local governments. And I see this just being one of those, because school districts know best what to do locally with their children. I think that we should allow school districts to continue doing what they've always done, taking care of all our children.
Representative Simmons, you mentioned the Obama directive. It's part of the rationale for this. Indeed, President Trump rescinded the Obama directive pretty quickly. Secretary DeVos and others in Washington made very clear that it was their intention to do that. If the Obama directive was the issue and the president rescinded the directive once he got into office, why are we still talking about that?
Well, I think that was what started the issue.
All
right. And then as this issue unfolded, probably many of us weren't aware that we had some of our political subdivisions and some of our school districts taking a stand that was more aggressive. The Dripping Springs, I think most people have heard about Dripping Springs. We had an incident in Coppell up in my area. I have not read it, but evidently Dallas Independent School District just passed a policy related to this. So what happens, okay, and it's, even though it's a totally different situation, it's a little bit like the Uber scenario. is that once this train starts down the track, it gains momentum and other political subdivisions begin doing it. So that begs the question of us in Austin.
Right.
And sometimes the answer is no, okay? It is the question of, should this be handled at the state level?
So this really is, at the end of the day, Representative Simmons, about local control. This is a part of the narrative that is the through line of this session has been to restrict the ability of mayors and city council members and county commissioners to do certain things. You mentioned ride hailing. There's a discussion right now about trees, bags, all the sort of aspects of this that are under the broad umbrella of local control. This is yet another one of those things in your mind.
Yeah, and I think what people may not understand, and I'm not sure before I got involved in this business that I totally grasped it as well, but that Texas operates totally different from the federal Constitution. Political subdivisions only exist because of the state constitution.
Right.
The state's not made up of a bunch of cities. The state authorizes there to be political
Right.
subdivisions.
This is the argument that the state created the cities and the state created the federal government, and therefore the state is sovereign actually going upstream and downstream.
That's the way the Constitution
Right.
works.
Your bill, you have two pieces of legislation in this first called special, HB 46, HB 50. 46 really seems to be the vehicle for this conversation. In fact, you wrote an op-ed yesterday that ran in the Dallas Morning News. I wrote it previously, but it ran yesterday, in which you laid out your rationale for this. You have shorthanded the description of this bill to say that it would ensure no political subdivision, to your point, creates a protected class over and above what state or federal law permits. That is the description of the bill. Nowhere in that description is the word bathroom, is the word transgender, is the word locker room. What are you getting at here with this bill?
Well, what we're trying to say is that if there is a protected class established, and there are a lot of protected classes out there,
Yeah.
that those should be established through state or federal law. That's the best place
Yeah.
for them to be established, in my opinion. And people can have other opinions on that. That's fine.
Right.
And this is one of those issues where that now it does only pertain to multi-occupancy restrooms, showers, and changing facilities.
Right, but you also do get to, and we'll come to this a little bit later in the conversation, anti-discrimination ordinances are also in your sights that communities might pass, correct?
Not as far as this bill's concerned.
Not as far as this bill, but generally speaking, in the conversation around this, I know on the Senate side that's a component of it, is to preclude municipalities from passing anti-discrimination ordinances.
But it wouldn't be right to comment on what might be in the future.
Well, I'm going to push back on that in a second.
But can I say
Senator Garcia,
something?
you brought up the transgender rights or discrimination question that has been at the center of this from the very beginning. I didn't hear the word transgender in what Representative
Well, no,
Simmons
he
is
didn't,
talking
and
about.
he didn't, when I talked about, for example, the civil rights ordinance that people call HERO from Houston,
Yes.
that wasn't about only the transgender community. It involved veteran status, marital status, a lot of
It also wasn't only about
protections.
bathrooms,
And
Senator,
it
too, right?
had nothing, and there was not, the word bathroom was not in there, period. The bottom line here is that his bill actually is saying, you all can discriminate because we're not going to let you say that you can't.
Right.
So to me, when this gets challenged in court, I think any judge, and I've been a judge, I can't say I'm a constitutional scholar, but I did study the Constitution. I just think that this just smacks against everything we're about. It is discrimination. And when we question many of the proponents of this bill, they always say, oh no, this is not about the transgender community. That's exactly who it's about when you ask for a birth certificate. For some reason, this party seems to be very fixated on birth certificates and people's private parts. Now we're seeing even the president, they're going to probably check birth certificates before you get into the bunker. What's coming next?
Right.
I think transgender community is being targeted. I think it's shameful. And even the governor's tweet, I think it was yesterday, when there was a list of the top 20, it didn't say bathrooms, it didn't say locker rooms, it said transgender bathrooms.
Right, he was retweeting a picture from one of the newspapers. As they say, retweets are not endorsements, but I take your point.
Well, that's not the way I see it. If
Yeah.
you retweet it, that means you must agree with it. Otherwise, why would you retweet it?
Right. Representative Simmons, do you have any issue with the transgender community?
No, I don't. And let me take issue with what Senator Garcia said respectfully, and that is what this bill is about. It's about an expectation of privacy. And it's also about treating people with dignity. I agree with Senator Garcia that the vast majority of our political subdivisions, especially our school districts, because that's the thing that the governor really pointed out,
Yep.
treat these people, treat all of their students appropriately. And so, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to have forced upon our school-age children to be able to have to use these same intimate facilities together when they do have biological differences. The challenge...
Is it that you don't want to, Representative, is it that you don't want to force them, or is it that you don't want to allow them?
No, it's force them.
How do you force
How do
someone to do that?
let me ask that question. How would status quo allow, how would they be forced?
Well, that's very simple.
Do you agree that the distinction between force and allow?
I understand the difference between force and allow,
Yeah.
but if there is one locker room, one shower, and the school has a policy that says that everybody is going to use the same facility, then they're going to, if they're going to use that, then they're going to be forced by policy to use that together. I mean, that's...
And so to remedy that, your bill would do what? Because as you laid out in the Dallas News yesterday, there are 3 things that you're attempting to do. You talked about this specifically as the first of those, to preserve the dignity of these kids in school. You specifically cite these kids. What would your bill do to rectify or remedy that problem?
My bill would say you can't have a policy that forces that situation on them, and hopefully what the school districts would do would handle it with the dignity and respect that Senator Garcia has said they have no defense. If you think about it, is that for the 171 years now we've been a state, correct? 1846, I believe, is when we became a state. So it's 171, is that correct? Is my math right?
I don't know.
That's right. I think that's right. Am I right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
We'll go with it.
Let's go with it, okay?
I went into journalism not to do math.
Look,
I'm
I was
sorry.
born in Louisiana, raised in Arkansas, got to Texas fast as I could spell it at age 25, so I've got, give me a little grace here. But we've operated how we've operated, and I think everyone in this state, for the most part, under this scenario, have been treated with respect. We did the Texas Miracle during this time. We had the greatest growth of any state. So what I'm saying is time out. Let's go back to how things were, you know, a year and a half ago until we can figure it out at the state level.
Are you aware, Representative Simmons, of any school districts that, to your description, force boys and girls to use the same facilities?
Well, I haven't read everybody's specific policies.
Can you cite one?
I think the Dripping Springs issue, we had an issue in Coppell, and this was in a restroom scenario.
Right.
And that's just 2 out of all the cities, all the school districts in our state.
That's right, but one's
1,000.
too many in my opinion. But, you know.
Senator, to the representative's point, there's nothing wrong with wanting to ensure that kids especially are given the opportunity to feel like their privacy and their, you know, they want to be with people. They want to make the decision themselves, not be told you need to or you're put in a situation where you're uncomfortable. That's his point. Do you disagree with it?
Well, obviously, you know, I will always put dignity and diversity above discrimination.
Yep.
And I think what he's talking about in his bill is just flat out discrimination. I don't see how they can try to argue around it because it's there. And if you're, you know, he can't cite one school district because frankly, I don't think there is one. As my superintendent tells me, and most of them do, they've been handling this. They don't need any new rules. And no one's going to argue with you that you don't want boys and girls bathroom. But the bottom line here is that trans boys are boys, trans girls are girls, and trans boys are boys. And that's what I think they fail to respect and understand the dynamics.
This was
unless
something-
you continue to do, if you continue to do that, then we're not going anywhere, because if this really was about boys and girls bathroom, they would just stop and say, we don't want men going to women's rooms, women going into men's rooms, period. No requirement for birth certificate, no requirement for a driver's license if he accepts the Senate version, which quite frankly, the driver's license doesn't help any of our kids because they don't drive.
Representative Simmons, Senator Garcia has brought up the question of birth certificates and IDs a couple times now. Your bill does not make any provision for requiring identification, doesn't mention birth certificates.
Does not.
You did say yesterday, though, in your Dallas Morning News op-ed, the exact quote was, sex is, where is that quote? Sex is biological sex?
Well, what I said is that there are court cases and again, I'm not a lawyer,
Yeah.
but from what I understand, there are court cases, settled court case law, that people have an expectation of privacy in
Right.
various levels of undress. And the court had, with the opposite sex.
Right.
And the court has defined sex in those cases
Right.
as biological
Why didn't you
sex.
include anything like that in your bill?
Well, because I believe my bill is about the policy, not about the individual, okay?
So you'll refuse
My
to
bill-
accept or agree to any amendments that get into the issue of ID? Or-
That's not what the intention of my bill is. You always have to see how things go if it gets to conference or whatever.
So how are you going to really check that? I mean, are we going to have
I
to
don't-
inspect people's private parts?
I don't
mean,
know that you are going to be able to check it.
I mean, you
So-
understand,
Yeah,
Representative Simmons.
I'm
this is
staying on the policy
This is
side
not an
of it.
insignificant question. It's come up. I know Senator Hinojosa during the debate last week brought it up. He is hardly the first person to do so. What is the enforcement mechanism here? How do you enforce this, and how do you punish
The
it?
enforcement mechanism in my bill is that say a school district, just use as an example, that's
Yes.
the easy one we can use, cannot have a policy, all right, related to this issue that, again, allows, whatever you want to say, forces these kids to be together in the same multi-occupancy facilities, all right? And so our focus is going to be on what their policy or their practice is. It's not on going down and having someone stand at the locker room, right?
Yeah.
And if a policy is in place, or we hear that it's in place, the Attorney General is set up to investigate that, and they can obtain adjunctive relief.
But if there's not a
injunctive relief.
policy, and yet there's a violation of the non-policy, what happens at that point? So let's say there's no policy, but the practical impact of the lack of a policy is that it's anarchy. People do whatever they want. And in some cases, this happens.
Well,
What do you do then?
Yeah, in school districts specifically, I don't think they will do whatever they want. Most schools, kids will follow what the quote-unquote rules are, whether they're written
Right.
or implied.
Yeah.
And if a young transgender person does something different than that on an occasion, that's going to be up to the school as to how they handle that.
Right. Senator Garcia, I've been confused about the question of enforcement and penalties on this from the very beginning. And in fact, one of the things that happened in the conversation around what is now SB3, had been SB6, now is SB3 during the special, is there are no penalties in the bill that passed last week, correct?
Well, there isn't, and I think the how to enforce who complains is the real problem here, because if you have a policy, then how is the Attorney General going to know that there was a violation? That means someone's going to complain, and I think that
Well, it sounds like the mere fact of the policy is problem enough.
right. And so
to
then,
represent
so
Simmons.
who complains? Another child? I mean, I think it's going to lead to outing of school children that are transgender. It's going to lead to more bullying. It's going to lead to more emotional harm, more attack, more targeting. I mean, I just think that this bill is so harmful to the children of our state. It has no place in our schools.
Representative Simmons, you talked about today and in the Dallas News over the weekend about the aspect of this related to kids. Is that your only concern?
That's my major concern. Now, there are some privacy concerns with, I'm married, got a wife, got a daughter, with how the gender identity definition, not for the transgender community, that's not what we're talking about. We understand that true transgender people identify how they identify, but it does allow potentially for people to take advantage of that broad identity, which is relatively recent, I believe, to maybe use that for nefarious reasons.
So you floated the possibility yesterday in the paper about a male who wishes to be in a woman's facility to do women harm.
Or just simple voyeurism, and that in itself is harm.
And given the latitude to do so effectively, legally, by a policy that would permit someone to claim to be transgender for the purposes of getting into that. That was your point.
I believe, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I believe that if someone that is not transgender but claims to be because they can say they're feeling like they are that day, then
It just doesn't happen that way. I mean, it seems to me, with all due respect, Representative, that you just don't seem to understand.
It hasn't happened that way.
You don't seem
but
to understand what a transgender person has to go through to transition the medical consultations, the therapy. It's not something that today, in front of everybody, right now, I'm going to say, oh, beginning this
But
afternoon,
actually, Senator,
I'm going to start wearing pants and I'm going to be a man.
Senator,
That's not the way it works.
Under the definition
but it
of
doesn't
gender
work that
identity.
way. You can read
But
that
people can
definition
use it
any
for
way you want
nefarious
to.
reasons.
It doesn't work that way. You've got to acknowledge that trans boys are boys and trans girls are girls. If you don't do that and insist on a birth certificate to check people's body parts, private parts, I think it's just wrong. It's discrimination.
You're talking about,
and we have no place in Texas.
impersonation, is what you're talking
That's
about.
correct.
You're not talking about
Well,
somebody who claims to be
but
transgender. You're talking about somebody who is using this
I don't think
essentially as
there's
a
been
Trojan
one
horse.
case that anyone can cite that was actually happened.
And I want to ask about that because, again, as we all say, well, help us understand what problem we're trying to solve. Again, from the very beginning of this conversation, we've said, could you provide us with any evidence, any statistical data that would suggest there's an epidemic of men and women's facilities that would cause the legislature to stop in its tracks and take up this issue ahead in line of many others? Are you aware of any such data?
Let me ask you this question, and that is, are you aware of any data that says on how it was been handled in the past that the transgender community has had problems with our public facilities? Has there been any reports of that? Has there
Well,
been
I'm not
any
trying to pass a
violations
bill,
of that?
Representative. I'm asking you because you are.
So what I'm saying is this, that where we had the status quo until we can figure out the state level is adequate. That's what I believe is adequate until someone can get 76 representatives, 16 senators, and 1 governor to sign a bill. I believe that's adequate.
So you can't, just to be sure, just to be clear, you don't have at your disposal data that would suggest that there is a public safety problem.
I think there have been reports of that. I mean, Target had an issue with that after this came out. I don't have any right here on my fingertips that I could, this one, this one, this one. But I just know intuitively that people can do things that were not the original intent.
You understand, Representative, that this is a conversation we have in the legislature on a whole bunch of issues. The legislature has a limited amount of time, 140 days every 2 years. Really, for the first 60 days, you only honor little leagues. So it's really 80 days, right, that you do the business of the state. The business of the 11th largest economy, a state of 28 million people, you do it for 80 days over the course of 2 years. Not only on this issue, people say, why are you all focusing on A, B, C when the real priorities of the state ought to be D through Z? And so people ask on this, is the problem sufficiently large enough to be taking your time and attention away from the things that may be considered more important to be on this? And I'm simply asking for what the basis for that hierarchy is.
And I'm saying that the ability to protect our school children, to not have them required in a certain situation, the ability to protect, maybe it's not a lot, but even one of our wives or daughters that are violated, not through, we have crimes, we have laws against physical, but just walking in there. I mean, that in itself is a violation, and it's voyeurism, so it is against the law, but how are you going to prove that if somebody says, well...
So, Senator, the public safety issue that has come up is often couched in terms of, well, the stuff that they're trying to litigate or legislate against right now is illegal already.
Well, there's laws in the books to handle all of this, which is why there's never been an incident. Let me just say this. I've got about 60 years plus experience as a woman, and I've gone to a lot of bathrooms, including like during the Houston rodeo into some that are male because the line is too long in the female. I mean, that's always my worst fear when I really got to go, that there's a huge line I have to face. And I tell you what, I don't have any fear of any transgender woman being in the bathroom. I mean, to me, this is so made up and so non-existent. We're wasting our time, we're wasting the time of the taxpayers, and we're wasting, quite frankly, a lot of resources in the state that should be going elsewhere. When you compare the economic impact, the harm to children,
well, we'll come to the economic,
the mandates,
the
local control. I could go on and on, but you don't have enough time today.
Representative.
Which is exactly why I say, why have these ordinances been passed? Why were they, if there was no issue in the past, it's not the state that started this issue. It started, as you know, for the big discussion was in Houston. Houston people then voted on that. They overturned it. That's where all of this came up. It was because the political subdivisions.
But there's no reason for the state to get involved.
But there's no reason for the
handled.
city to have gotten involved in that either, because if there was no issue, you just said that in your 60 years, okay,
Well,
and in my 56 years, I don't know that I've had an issue either.
As I said before, the ordinance in Houston was more than was not about bathrooms. It was about public accommodations. It was about access to schools. It was about a lot of different
But
things.
you and I know,
You
Senator,
all have made it into this
Senator, you and
phantom person who's going to put on a wig, a man, and then go past
You and I know
the
that
front
what
gate,
drove
past
that-
the
what
security, and
drove
be
that-
able to find a bathroom. It's ludicrous.
Senator, you and I know what drove that was this issue. It wasn't about veterans, really. It wasn't about the disabled, which they're already covered. It was this particular issue of the transgender community. And I understand, and I absolutely support everybody needs to be treated with dignity. And if there's a problem, we need to take care of that if they're not.
Representative Simmons, you talk a lot about school kids. That's been a big priority. I know you've said it's about other things as well. There was a piece of legislation during the regular session that would have limited this very closely boundaried to just affecting schools. That was the so-called Chris Patty amendment.
Correct.
Right. Why is that not enough? Why would Patty not be enough, or some version of the Patty amendment? Why would we need to go farther?
Well, I voted for the Patty amendment, but I think the reason it's not enough is because TASB the next day said it didn't do anything and wouldn't make anybody change one policy that they had. So that brought up concern. At least that's what was printed in the paper.
Can you get your legislation through? You had an attempt at this during the regular session. You had more than 80 or about 80 co-authors, I think, in the end. Mm-hmm. You've got many fewer than that this time. You've got about 50. You've lost some. I mean, there's still time to add more.
There's still plenty
Is
of time.
support for your legislation during this session there to the degree that you can pass this?
If the vote gets to the floor, it absolutely passes.
Right.
The problem is, it's not a majority. The majority doesn't control whether it gets to the floor. Whether it gets to the floor is totally controlled by the Speaker of the House, whom I respect and have a good relationship with, but who is against this legislation, and by the committee in which it goes through, which is Chairman Cook.
State Affairs.
Chairman Cook has said he's going to give us a hearing, but at the same time, he said he's not going to move the legislation. Now, anything could happen in the next 3 weeks. That could change. So we're going to continue working hard like we can get the right balance. And again, I'm open to discussion on any of this to try to make it the best and for all the people that are
In fact, Chairman Cook has said specifically that he supports a version of the bill that would be similar to what the
so
Patty
that's what's
amendment.
confusing to me
Right.
as to why he says he may not send it out.
But he supports Patty, not Simmons.
Well, he could come to me with, I'm happy to work with him on wording that might please both of us.
Right,
Happy to do that.
But as of right now, you think that the prospects for this are not great for the reasons that you suggested.
I think the prospects are not great not because the majority doesn't want it, and over 60% of the people polled, both Democrats and Republicans want it when you look at the polls, but because there are some key leaders that do not want it. And that's the way our system works, okay?
Right.
I mean, it works.
Senator Garcia, Representative Simmons just very helpfully brought up the question of public opinion and public polling. I'm not sure where his numbers are from.
Well, y'all's
But
numbers are very different.
I've got numbers that are the numbers
Texas
that came
Tribune
from the
poll
Tribune.
said 30% thinks it's a
Well, it was
priority.
44% believed that it was important. This was as of the last poll in June.
Right.
47% said not. The percentage of all Texans who believe that this legislation was important, and of course it's about the wording of the question. I mean, the question was worded in a way, that was the answer.
No question.
Right? It went up 5% from the time that we did it in February. Republicans overwhelmingly supported. I think there's non-Tea Party Republicans, you saw an increase of 10% in support. Tea Party Republicans went from 39 to 70%. I think it's not. I don't know what the basis for saying all Texans overwhelmingly supported. It seems like it's a split at best. Although support seems to be increased from February to June. Now, this is representative democracy. You represent the people you serve. If you knew that the majority of people in your Senate district, Senator, were for this, would you be for it?
I might, and I am obviously representing my district and my city, both. And let me just say this. If the question is, do you want boys in girls' bathrooms? I'm disappointed that it's only 70%. It should be 100% because nobody wants men in women's bathrooms.
Yeah.
The question is transgender boys, transgender girls. So it's how you ask the question. And we faced all this. I mean, I was part of the Houston campaign. I campaigned for that civil rights ordinance. So I know exactly what it was about. With all due respect to the representative's characterization of our ordinance, I know what it was about because I was campaigning for it.
Yeah.
Because it was about, making sure that everyone is protected and that Houston continues to be a welcoming city.
But you know,
and
Senator,
city
that the
of
opponents of
diversity.
the opponents of the HERO ordinance did make
they-
it primarily about bathrooms,
Well, and I
were
was getting to
successful in
that,
doing
Evan,
so. Yeah.
and it was the opponents who turned it into a bathroom issue
Right.
with their TV ads and their radio ads, and it's that same element is now here in Austin. So I think if we look, maybe his poll is just GOP primary voters.
Well, the
And
lieutenant
that
governor has
wouldn't
done.
shock
Yeah.
me
The
because
lieutenant governor has done polling. He did polling in the beginning of the year that was all
Right.
voters. He did polling in June that was just Republicans, and in June he found that 64% of Republicans supported this legislation, 31%.
But when I'm pointing that out, it's important to know which poll it is and what the question
And
was.
what the specific
what the
question was.
specific question was.
Right.
Because I think if you tell people that it's a trans boy and a boys restroom and trans girl, I think they'd be fine with it because we've been dealing with it like forever.
Senator, you brought up the HERO ordinance a couple times. I want to ask you about the economic impact on the
Sure.
state as has been predicted during both the regular and the special sessions. You know there was a now famous study of the Texas Association of Business and other groups.
Debunked study.
I'll get there. Predicting economic doom should the legislation pass during the session. PolitiFact came in behind and said that in fact those numbers were not good numbers. Business community has come back during the special session
Correct.
very aggressively, IBM in the lead, but not just IBM, a number of global corporations, a lot of CEOs and a lot of companies that people think of as conservative supporting this legislation, Michael Dell, and a number of others, opposing any kind of legislation of this sort. There have been predictions of economic doom and gloom. That is a resonant argument for you that the state is at some risk economically?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whether, now there's two others. Angelo Economics has done one, and so has the Perriman Group, and they range from 3.3 billion to 6 billion.
Yeah.
The
The
hard facts are there.
lieutenant governor has denied the validity of any such predictions and has even denied the numbers out of North Carolina all along. He said that they're illegitimate measures of what the economic impact has been.
Well, I think the challenge there is that most events plan ahead 2, 3, even 5 years. So
Right.
it may be too early to see the real economic effects in North Carolina because it's just been, a year, maybe 2.
Yeah.
So we won't feel it in terms of future conventions and future events till 3 or 4 years. But what's real is whether or not there's been any stops on moving and expansion or any commitments. And I know in Houston, our Convention and Visitors Bureau has already indicated
Right.
that there's been 1 or 2 conventions that say no, they're not coming. And they're not coming because of this, and combined with the anti-immigrant sanctuary
SB4,
cities bill,
right,
SB4, you combine those two together, it's going to be hard, and it's going to be
Right.
the workers, it's going to be the children in schools, it's going to impact all the way around, which is why I don't understand why the big government Republicans don't understand that, because they've always been about supporting business.
Was there not, Senator Garcia, after the HERO ordinance was undone by the voters of Houston, were there not predictions that if the HERO ordinance were undone, that the city's economy was going to go to hell? Did it go to hell?
Well, as I said, it takes 2, 3, 4 years before you can determine.
It's been a while since the HERO ordinance was undone, Senator. I mean, I think this is a point that the critics of, or that the supporters of the legislation have repeatedly made, that you predicted that everything would go into the drink
and they point to
when
the
HERO
Super
was
Bowl.
undone, and it didn't.
Right, and
Super
they-
Bowl still came. There hasn't been
Because
some-
the Super Bowl commitment was made 7 years ago. They're not going to change their mind within 6 months and say, oh, time out, we're going to change. It takes too long
Can
to
you
undo.
point to anything negative that has happened to the economy of the city of Houston
Like right
since
now,
the HERO
not today.
ordinance?
I'd have to talk with the convention center folks.
Representative Simmons, are you concerned about the economic health of this state pivoting in a negative direction off of this legislation?
Let me unfold your question a couple different ways, because you
Okay.
said something at first that I really wanted to talk about. You brought up the IBM, other companies like
Yep.
that, and I respect their ability.
Some companies that you invest in.
Yes, I expect their ability to take position, respect their ability to
Yeah.
take positions. But it's interesting, because when I ask each one of them, when I go into their offices, what are their restroom facilities? You know what they are? Men, women. They have locker rooms sometimes. Some of them have workout areas. They separate those, men, women. If they have the scenario where a transgender person goes into one that might be opposite of his biological sex, they handle that on an individual
They make an
basis.
accommodation.
Yes. It is the height of hypocrisy
Right.
in my opinion, for these companies, which this bill does not have an effect on what they can or can't do.
Right.
It doesn't even have an effect on anybody that leases one of our convention centers or our stadiums, okay? They can do whatever they want to. When Mary Kay comes to Dallas and does the big convention, it's 98% ladies. And so they take all the men's restrooms pretty much and turn them into, they can do all of that, all right? They can, whatever their policy they want to be. So I believe that the economic impact calamity that they're predicting is a red herring. Does that mean that everybody will come to Texas that was going to? Doesn't necessarily mean that, okay? But I believe what we'll find is that Texans, like we always have, we search to find the right answers, to try to treat everybody.
Right. That's not a persuasive argument for you, the economic argument.
Not for me.
Yeah. Representative, you brought up the question of private businesses and stadiums and all that. If we have a public safety problem to the degree that we're concerned about men who should not be in women's facilities, why are we not extending this legislation to incorporate all facilities, public, private, government, non-government, state, local? Why? This was Senator Zaffarini's point, I know, during the Senate debate last week, because one of the things that the Colcourse bill did was
Accept an amendment.
It accepted an amendment that basically took state buildings off of the table. Now, county and city buildings are going to be subject to regulation, but state or not. There's an exemption for stadiums. I know there was a lot of pressure from a number of sports owners and sports teams to be exempted. If this is a problem, presumably it does not stop at the schoolhouse door.
I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, in my bill anyway, I can't speak on behalf of Senator Colcourse, of course, but in my bill, again, what we're trying to say is that we had a pretty good thing going for 170 years, and we're trying to get back to that point. And we've never, ever, even in the past 170 years, had a restriction or regulation on how businesses handled those facilities. We really try to do our best to stay out of private business, but there are other things of which we have direct constitutional responsibility.
Right.
And school districts.
Well, you also control state buildings, but at least in the Senate side, they saw fit to exempt it. I mean, I'll take your argument on the private businesses, whether everybody agrees with it or not, but you could conceivably control state buildings if you wanted to.
Yes, you could.
How come you're not?
Well, my bill deals with political subdivisions. The state is not a political subdivision.
Yeah.
All right. And in the House, that would not be germane to the part of the code that I'm working in. We'd have to have a separate bill for that.
On the stadium question, Representative, one of the questions that's come up repeatedly is whether the NCAA and other sports leagues, tournaments, and so on would decide not to do business with us here. This was, of course, after the North Carolina legislation, which was then eventually tweaked, and then the NCAA came back in. You have any reason to be concerned about that?
Well, I'm just so glad you asked that question.
Yeah.
And that is because the North Carolina tweak, as it is, or repeal and revision, essentially does exactly what HB 46 does. And the NCAA is okay with the North Carolina bill. The NFL is okay with it. Now, they're not out making huge statements. And so if the NCAA is going to be okay with the way North Carolina operates under their scenario today, then they're going to be okay with the way Texas operates today. I have not had one person tell me definitively that they have got proof that NCAA has said, if this bill passes, we're not coming.
Well, in fact, there are 12, as I understand it, there are 12 NCAA championship games that are on the books for Texas from 2019 to 2022, not counting the Final Four next year. Now, of course, no legislation has passed. We don't know what would happen if legislation passed.
Well, you have to assume that if they're okay in North Carolina, they would be okay here.
Yeah.
Senator,
should we be concerned about that?
Real quick? So does that mean you're going to push your bill and not accept the Senate version?
I don't know what's going to happen in the long run.
Well, because you just keep talking about your bill.
I
and
wrote
your bill
my
is a
bill-
little different than Senator Colcourse's bill.
Yes, ma'am.
So
I wrote my bill like I think it should be done. And I think Senator Colcourse has some great points in her bill, especially about Title IX as to how that's handled. But again, I'm focusing on the way I thought we ought to attack the issue.
But I think I asked you this question about amending your bill earlier and what happens if your bill does get to the floor and passes. You could say, if you believe that your bill is the right bill, that you're not going to accept amendments that would make your bill more like the Senate bill.
Right. And I don't anticipate accepting any amendments.
You do not anticipate accepting any
I
amendments?
that. I don't.
So you're not going to exempt private business?
It's already exempt in mine just by
because you
de
understand
facto.
that most of the incidents that people have cited about problems in the bathroom had nothing. in fact, many of them, it was transgender men or women that were attacked, and most of the incidents happened in private business. You cited Target.
My bill doesn't
That
deal
is not a
with
public
the-
school.
would do with the
I want to be
Yeah.
sure I heard you properly because I think this is significant. So when the
Yeah.
Freedom Caucus, Schaefer and those guys crawl up your nose if this does get to the floor, trying to amend this bill to make it look like the Senate bill, you are not going to accept amendments.
I don't intend to at this particular time.
I don't
Doesn't mean
intend
there's
to is not
something
the
that would
same
make
as
it
I'm not
better.
going to. Are you or aren't
Right.
you?
Well, that's my statement.
Your statement is I don't intend to take amendments
That's
at
exactly
this time.
right. I just think legislation has ebbs and flows. I mean, there may be somebody else in the House that has an amendment that comes from the other side that makes sense. So you have to look at that. But I believe that the bill that we filed, either HB 46 or HB 50, that just deals with schools,
Is sufficient.
is sufficient.
Senator
I
Garcia,
absolutely
the response by Senator Kolkhorst in the Senate side to this conversation about economic development and to the NCAA and other tournaments not bringing their business here was daughters over dollars. Daughters over dollars. That we should not be putting economic development or business that comes to the state ahead of these other issues. Your response to that is what?
Oh, my response was simple. I put dignity and diversity over discrimination.
Right.
And this is what both of the bills are. It's about discrimination, and this state should not be about allowing and condoning discrimination. And his bill does that by saying school districts, you can't have a policy to protect or make sure that someone's not discriminated against. That is actually telling people, hey, you have carte blanche to discriminate if you want to at the school level. And that's just wrong.
I would disagree with that.
That's not a surprise. I get that.
And we kind of expected that.
Yeah,
That's okay.
Before we go to questions from the audience, the Title IX issue came up. Representative Simmons brought it up. That was sort of a guest star in this debate during the Senate discussion of the bill that I don't think people really anticipated. All of a sudden, we're now talking about sports and Title IX.
Right.
In fact, that was an attempt. That occasioned
Well, and
an
I
attempt
agree
by
with, of course,
Senator
with
Watson,
Senator Watson.
that it was
not on the
non-germane.
call.
It was
It
not
should
on the
not have been
call.
on there.
That was overruled by Lieutenant Governor. What exactly does the bill that Senator Kolkhorst passed do on Title IX? What does it say?
Well, I was at a loss as to why it was even in there.
But this gets to men participating in women's sports, women participating
Well,
in men's
and I
sports.
think it goes to, again, just as I've asked the representative, I asked Senator Clover several times, does she believe that trans boys are boys and trans girls are girls? Because that is the crux of the issue. And
Right.
when we're talking about athletics, I mean, even the collegiate, I forget the name of the group that oversees that, I think it's NCAA. I mean,
NCAA.
they've accepted that trans boys are boys and they participate in boys' events. And again, they're fixated on that birth certificate and checking people with private parts. They want people to compete based on a birth certificate, and that's just crazy because they go through so much in terms of again, the medical and the things that they've got to do that it changes the body. And that's what people need to accept.
Representative Simmons, you seem more sympathetic to what Senator Kolkhorst is trying to do on the Title IX stuff.
Well, I believe that for many transgender people, what you say is exactly right, because they're going through therapy, hormone therapy, and other things, so they're
Estrogen
changing
therapy,
their body.
it
Sometimes they
changes their
even
body,
go
their
through
muscle tone,
surgical
their strength
changes.
levels.
However, the definition of gender identity, Senator, does not require them to do that. That's the
So
challenge.
now you think a
And
wrestler's
so-
going to put on a wig and try to wrestle with the girls?
It doesn't matter. You don't have to put on a wig. He could just say
That
that's
is just
that's-
ludicrous.
Is that in
Then
your
why
bill?
don't
But
we-
that's not in your
Why
bill.
don't we reduce why don't we reduce the definition of gender identity so that encompasses what you talked about, is to making it so broad? Because if you have someone that's able to self-identify as the opposite sex, and especially if it's a man in women's sports can be decimated by that.
So where's this provision in your bill if it's so important?
Well, I have not dealt with Title IX. I don't, in the House, in the way that our rules work, I don't think I can deal with Title IX in my bill.
Do you think it's not germane?
I don't, I haven't asked a parliamentarian yet about that, and I intend to talk to him about that.
Let's stop there and bring in some questions from the audience. Agnes has a microphone. Please walk the microphone around, or she'll walk the microphone around if you put your hand up. Here first, we've got one at the opposite end. Next. Hi.
Representative Simmons, my name is Cal Gacy. You might remember me. You blocked me on Twitter the night that I testified against your bill in the House. You blocked a number of transgender people I would like to make a point here.
You have a
that
question? You have a question?
Yes, I do. My question, well, I have a point that I would like to address, have you address. Transgender people have been around and have been written about ever since recorded history begun. This isn't about Obama. This isn't about Title IX. This is about a group of Baptists who have taken over the legislature and are forcing a bill that would discriminate against the most vulnerable part of the LGBT community. This happened since marriage equality was passed. I've seen some things that were said during, legislatures were saying, do you know about this transgender thing? And other legislators were saying, no, I never heard of it. The reason you never heard of them is because we have never been an issue. There's never been an instance in the state of a transgender person breaking the law or infringing on anybody's privacy.
Please, your question, please.
This is about bigotry. How would you respond to that accusation?
What do you say about that?
That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
I don't know why we have political subdivisions of the state trying to change what's been going on for 170 years. If there's never been an issue, then things evidently have been working well. Why don't we leave them the same if everybody's been treated with the dignity that they should have?
So you're willing to stipulate to the questioner's point that transgender people are not or have not been a problem that the state needs to somehow address broadly?
Not that I'm aware
broadly
of.
defined.
That's correct.
What about the argument about vulnerability? I think the questioner makes a good point. You know, this has come up repeatedly, most famously in the New Yorker magazine story in which Speaker Strauss was quoted as saying, "Tell the Lieutenant Governor I don't want the suicide of one Texan on my hands." Behind that was this question of whether the transgender community is a vulnerable population and the vulnerability of the transgender community would be adversely affected by legislation of this sort.
Well, and again, I'm not 100% expert on this, obviously, but it's my understanding through my reading that countries like Norway and Denmark, which are very open to transgender community, that their suicide rate in that community is exactly the same
Materially
as it is
no
here.
different
That's
than-
right. So I think Speaker Strauss on that particular point was not correct.
Well, but Evan, let's not forget that study after study has shown that, I mean, while suicide rate is about as high as close to 41, 42,
40%, yeah.
40% for transgender community, especially under the younger age, it's only about 4% for the general population. And in Texas alone, we've already had six transgender women murdered, and it's only July. I mean, is that what we're going to have to look forward to? I mean, again, this is bad bill. It's bad and will harm children.
There's a question over there in the back. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I came here today because I'm really trying, but I'm failing to understand the safety argument. So under this bill,
understand the what argument? I'm sorry.
the safety argument.
Safety argument. Okay. Yes. I'm sorry.
Under this bill, couldn't an actual predator walk right into the girls' room and say, "Oh no, my parts are female. I'm supposed to be here"? So didn't you just make safety worse, not better? And the result of that is going to be that people who don't look like their birth certificate are going to be assumed to be predators. How does that not make safety worse instead of better?
Representative.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think the question is there the potential for this to have the opposite effect of what you mean, which is that you essentially create more of a public safety problem, you enable more people to be in the wrong facility or to prey on the vulnerable people of this state. Is there a potential for this to have the opposite effect? That's what you're asking, correct?
You can pretend to be trans to get into the girls' room more than one way.
Yeah, well, my question is, has that been an issue in the past?
Has the other way been an issue in the past?
It hasn't been an issue. My bill doesn't make it an issue. It just says, again, that we're going to take a time out here, leave things like they were, make sure we don't, in the school system, what we talked about. And so if it hasn't been an issue in the past, I don't anticipate it being an issue
Right, but
in
you
the
understand
future.
the questioner's point is the one that I tried to make, maybe not quite so articulately earlier, which is that the people who oppose this legislation have said from the beginning, just show us evidence that we have a public safety problem that we're trying to address. Said this to everybody, and repeatedly, there's not really been any data to suggest that there is a problem.
And my argument is, show me a public safety issue that these ordinances had to address. Because there hasn't been a problem. You just said it.
Yeah.
She just said it.
Right.
I mean,
and
it's a
that's-
circular discussion almost.
Well, Evan, I think
Yes,
it's
sir.
important
Ma'am.
to point out that just about every police chief and sheriff from across the state, from the major urban centers, where probably most of the transgender population is, it doesn't mean they're not all over Texas,
Right.
have said this does not help make anyone safer. In fact, it creates more problems than it solves. You know, we have these big government Republicans always talking about support the blues, support police, but they don't want to listen to them.
Right. Well, I know that
I mean, that
Senator,
is
at
hypocrisy.
the end of last week, there were a number of big city police chiefs who were here. I looked to see if Rex Reddert, who is the chief of police in Carrollton, had made a statement about this, and I was not able to find one. Have you had a conversation with the Carrollton police about how they view this issue?
I have not had a conversation with Chief Reddit at this particular time yet.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, thank you for allowing me. We're concentrating on women and children. Obviously, we all care about privacy and safety of everybody in a segregated space. We haven't talked about young boys. Young boys are obviously at risk as well. And if you talk about locker rooms and boys being safe or not safe, nobody's addressing that. This is completely ludicrous, as the senator keeps saying, about who we're protecting. If you want to talk about locker rooms and who's being abused, all we have to do is think about Penn State, and yet we are not talking about that. We're segregating a certain population because we think that that's okay, and using that fear-based tactic. Could you address that, how we're not protecting our young boys?
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying, and we need to make sure we pass the bill this time on teacher-student relationships. I don't know if you're aware with that or not, and I assume that's what you're talking about, is more of a teacher-student scenario or a coach-student scenario. And so we passed a bill related to try to improve that. There's no question our local school districts and the state needs to be make sure that we're doing better background checks on the people that are in daily contact with our children, whether they're boys or girls. But I hope you're not talking about just boys in a locker room, and that's where
just as vulnerable as
just
young women, and yet we're not addressing.
I know that they're vulnerable to whom?
Other boys and adults, the same thing that we're talking about girls in a school setting, being safe from other people.
I understand
We're not talking about that.
understand the adult situation for sure. Okay.
Does your legislation deal with only women's facilities, or does it deal with
It's
all
all
facilities?
multiple occupancy. Yeah.
Right, but that's not what you're talking about. You're not.
The code line for this is privacy and safety for boys, or for girls and women.
And it's about protecting girls and
And
women.
protecting girls and women is the tagline. It is a fear-based tactic when you're saying you have a wife and a daughter. We're not talking about boys. This is not about privacy and safety. You are simply.
I've got two sons and two
women.
grandsons as
But
well.
you're only
So
bringing that up now when I'm asking you about it. Nobody is talking about keeping all children safe in school, and that is exactly what we should be doing.
Representative, your
We should.
legislation does affect both
Yes.
sexes,
Yeah.
men's facilities, women's facilities.
Right. And
But
we should make sure that we keep
But how come
everybody
how
safe.
come the branding of this by the supporters of it has only been about women's facilities?
well, I can't talk about what other people say, but my thought on that,
Yeah.
particularly why I might say that, is because if someone is going to use this for nefarious purposes, it's more likely that a man identifying, quote unquote identifying, not really, as a woman is more likely to cause harm. Most of the abuse out there is men versus women, not women versus men or women versus boys.
Question, Agnes? You pick one, that's okay. Hi. Yes.
Hey, thank you. My name is Lisa Sheps. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Transgender Education Network of Texas. Representative Simmons, I've got a pretty simple question for you. You talked about women and girls, and specifically you said if it happens to one woman and one girl, that's enough for you. So let me ask you this question. Does it not work in the reverse? Is it okay for one trans person to be harmed in bathrooms? Because that has happened, sir. So how do you square that, where it's not okay for one woman, but it's certainly okay for several trans people?
No, I don't think it's okay for anyone to be harmed in a restroom. I absolutely agree with
Which is why
you.
these non-discrimination ordinances have been passed, to protect trans people from being harmed, because it has happened.
Okay, let's let him answer. So what about this?
If it has happened, we need to make sure that we have rules and laws in place to make sure that protect them as much as we can. There's absolutely no question
So
about
if the transgender community says to you that one way to address the problem of transgender Texans being harmed in facilities is for there to be local ordinances that are non-discrimination ordinances to protect those folks, would you not? You're not good with it.
Well, I am good with coming up with something that makes sure that they can be protected. I'm not good with coming up that could put other people at potential risk as well. Not by the transgender community, because I don't think there's any reports of that. But again, I believe that over the last, as long as we could think about it, like the Senator Garcia said, the transgender community has been here forever. I believe that the questioner had that earlier, is that this hasn't been an issue. I have never read about it. Have you? I mean, I haven't read about this being an issue one way or the other, right?
Well,
The
only
state did not.
Only really in the last 18 months has this
But we've
even
all
become
read
an issue.
about transgender people being attacked in bathrooms, at parks. As I said earlier, murdered. I mean, that is an issue
But
that is not addressed.
That
Of course,
doesn't. This law is not causing that.
but it could, absolutely. It's going to lead to more bullying. It's going to lead to more outing. It's going to end up with more harm to our children who don't have that driver's license, who don't have that birth certificate, and have no way to defend themselves.
You understand that one of the, I mean, you heard during the session, you heard testimony, or you heard of testimony, I should say, in the case of the Senate stuff most recently, you know, people saying, look, this legislation would actually put transgender Texans at more risk.
Absolutely.
SB 6, the way that was driven was totally different than what 2899 was, okay? Because that was dealt with the individual.
Yeah.
Mine deals with the policy that a political subdivision
Do you believe the
has in
Senate
place.
legislation does put transgender Texans
I
at
did
risk?
not say that, absolutely.
Yeah.
I did not say that. I'm saying that the individual in my situation is not penalized or criminalized or anything like that. It's about the policy so that all these situations can be handled with dignity and appropriateness. But we're also, at the same time, again, we're not going to, I will absolutely stand strong, and I think if you poll tested this, of how many people want 12-year-old biologically different boys and girls, whether they identify transgender or not, in the same changing facility, it's going to be well above 90%. And so why can't we agree on that and get to that solution?
Let me take one more here. Agnes, is our time okay to take one more? Okay, good, yes.
That being said, I do have an 11-year-old boy who identifies as a boy. I don't know the last time you spent any time in an elementary or middle school. I don't know how we're going to enforce this. That's my question. What are we going to make our teachers do? We're going to ask them if they're going through this transition, they're going to have to walk them to a facility to use the restroom? How are we going to enforce this under your bill, sir?
Well, in fact, you are talking about accommodations, single stall accommodations for, I mean,
But how are we, I mean, are the teachers going to have to walk them? I mean, are they going to have to show their birth certificate every day they go to school?
If an
How are we going to do this?
if an 11-year-old boy wants to go to the shower or locker room or multi-occupancy restroom with a 11-year-old girl, and the teacher knows about her, it comes to her attention, then they're going to have to make accommodation for that, okay? That's what assuming that that's the policy, assuming that the school, they can have a policy that would provide for that. They have to provide for the situation where they can treat that person with dignity and take care of that on an individual basis. But yes, under my policy, the school, under this bill, the school cannot have a policy that would allow them to be in the same multi-occupancy facility together.
So you're suggesting separate but equal?
I'm suggesting that if
That, you know,
there's,
that's been tried before, it doesn't work.
I'm just, Senator, that's inappropriate. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not, because you're suggesting
I'm
that
suggesting
the
you
accommodation
treat
could be a
people-
separate bathroom.
I'm suggesting-
That will out them, that will lead to profiling, that'll bring emotional and psychological harm to these kids. I think you're failing
So
to understand that.
do you not believe that if an 11-year-old, 12-year-old biological boy, even though he may be identifying trans, is in the same shower with a 12-year-old girl that does not identify as trans, that could be harmful to that girl psychologically? Absolutely it could be.
I don't think so.
You do not believe that?
No, I don't. Because it's happening already.
Then we can just agree to disagree on that.
Representative,
That's
it's
fine.
happening already. If it's a trans girl, that'll be in the girls' bathroom. If it's a trans boy in the boys' bathroom, it's happening every day in schools across this great state and country.
let me ask you as we get off to our days, 9 o'clock has come, we need to end.
Oh, we were
If
just
this
having
legis-
fun.
if this- Okay. might talk about the definition of fun after we talk about the definition of separate but equal. If this legislation does not pass, will the governor call you back for a second special session?
I don't have any idea.
You think he should? Would you ask him to, provided that
haven't.
your legislation does not pass?
I haven't even thought about that yet.
You haven't?
No.
You may be the only one who hasn't.
I've thought about it. I want to go home.
I'm trying not to think about a second session, but yes, I agree.
I appreciate
we agree on that.
I appreciate the fact that we color within the lines here, mostly in terms of staying civil and respectful, both on stage and in the audience. Please thank Senator Garcia, Representative Simmons. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We were just having fun.